Chapter 21. The stone walls crumble. The stone walls were crumbling and the light streaming through, but only for Chan. John Quincy was still groping in the dark, and his reflections were a little bitter as he returned to the house at Waikiki. Chan and he had worked together, but now that they approached the crisis of their efforts, the detective evidently preferred to push on alone, leaving his fellow worker to follow if he could. Well, so be it. But John Quincy's pride was touched. He had suddenly a keen desire to show Chan that he could not be left behind like that. If only he could, by some inspirational flash of deductive reasoning, arrive at the solution of the mystery simultaneously with the detective, for the honor of Boston and the winter slips. Frowning deeply, he considered all the old discarded clues again. The people who had been under suspicion and then dropped: Egan, the Compton woman Braid, Cowella, Weatherby, Saladin, Cope. He even considered several the investigation had not touched. Presently, he came to Bowker. What did Bowker's reappearance mean? For the first time in 2 weeks, he thought of the little man with the fierce pompadour and the gold-rimmed eyeglasses. Bowker, with his sorrowful talk of vanished barns and lost ferns behind the bar. How was the steward on the President Tyler connected with the murder of Dan Winterslope? He had not done it himself, that was obvious, but in some way he was linked up with the crime. John Quincy spent a long and painful period seeking to join Bowker up with one or another of the suspects. It couldn't be done. All through that Tuesday evening, the boy puzzled, so silent and straight that Miss Minerva finally gave him up and retired to the book. He awoke on Wednesday morning with the problem no nearer solution. Barbara was due to arrive at 10 o'clock from Kauai, and taking a small car, John Quincy went downtown to meet her. Pausing at the bank to cash a check, he encountered his old shipmate on the President Tyler, the sprightly Madame Maynard. "I really shouldn't speak to you," she said. "You never come to see me." "I know," he answered, "but I've been so very busy." "So, I hear, running around with policemen and their victims. I have no doubt you'll go back to Boston and report we're all criminals and cutthroats out here." "Oh, hardly that." "Yes, you will? You're getting a very biased view of Honolulu." "Why not? Stoop to associate with a respectable person now and then." "I'd enjoy it if they're all like you." "Like me? They're much more intelligent and charming than I am. Some of them are dropping in at my house tonight for an informal little party. A bit of a chat and then a moonlight swim." "Won't you come too?" "I want to, of course," John Quincy replied. "But there's Cousin Dan." Her eyes flashed. "I'll say it, even if he was your relative. 10 minutes of mourning for Cousin Dan is ample. I'll be looking for you." John Quincy laughed. "I'll come." "Do," she answered. "And bring your Aunt Minerva." "Tell her I said that she might as well be dead as hogtied by convention." John Quincy went out to the corner of Fort and King Streets, near which he had parked the car. As he was about to climb in, he paused. A familiar figure was jauntily crossing the street. The figure of Bowker, the steward, and with him was Willie Chan, the demon backstoker of the Pacific. "Hello, Bowker," John Quincy called. Mr. Bowker came blithely to join in. "Well, well, well, my old friend Mr. Winterslit. Shake hands with William Chan, the local Kai Cobb." "Mr. Chan and I have met before," John Quincy told him. "Know all the celebrities, eh?" "It's good. Well, we missed you on the President Tyler." Bowker was evidently quite sober. "Just got in, I take it," John Quincy remarked. "A few minutes ago. How about joining us?" He came closer and lowered his voice. "This intelligent young man tells me he knows a taxi stand out near each where one may obtain a superior brand fusel oil with a very pretty label on the bottle." "Sorry," John Quincy answered. "My cousin's coming in shortly on an inter-island boat, and I'm elected to meet her." "I'm sorry too," said the graduate of Dublin University. "If my strength holds out, I'm aiming to stage quite a little party, and I'd like to have you in on it. Yes, a rather large affair in memory of Tim. and as a last long farewell, the sevens. What? Your paw? Pow! It is. When I sail out of here tonight at 9 on the old PT, I am through forever. You don't happen to know a good country newspaper that can be bought for, well, say 10 grand. This is rather sudden, isn't it? John Quincy inquired. This is southern country out here, sir. Well, we must roll along. Sorry you can't join us. If the going's not too rough, and I can find a nice smooth tabletop to turn down an empty glass. For poor old Tim. So long, sir, and happy days. He nodded to Willie Chan, and they went on down the street. John Quincy stood staring after them, a puzzled expression on his face. Barbara seemed paler and thinner than ever, but she announced that her visit had been an enjoyable one, and on the ride to the beach appeared to be making a distinct effort to be gay and sprightly. When they reached the house, John Quincy repeated to his aunt, Mrs. Maynard's invitation. Let her come along, he urged. Perhaps I will, she answered. I'll see. The day passed quietly, and it was not until evening that the monotony was broken. Leaving the dining room with his aunt and Barbara, John Quincy was handed a cablegram. For hastily, it had been sent from Boston. Evidently, Agatha Parker, overwhelmed by the crude impossibility of the West, had fled home again, and John Quincy's brief, San Francisco or nothing, had followed her there. Hence the delay. Cablegrams, Agatha. John Quincy crushed it in his hand. He tried to suffer a little, but it was no use. He was a mighty happy man. The end of a romance. No, there had never been any nonsense of that kind between them. Just an affectionate regard, too slight to stand the strain of parting. Agatha was younger than he. She would marry some nice, proper boy who had no desire to roam. And John Quincy winter-slip with a read of her wedding. In the San Francisco papers, he found Miss Minerva alone in the living room. It's none of my business, she said, but I'm wondering what was in your cablegram. Nothing, he answered truthfully. All the same, you were very pleased to get it. He nodded. Yes. I imagine nobody was ever so happy over nothing before. Good heavens, she cried. Have you given up grammar too? I'm thinking of it. How about going down the beach with me? She shook her head. Someone is coming to look at the house. A leading lawyer, I believe he is. He's thinking of buying, and I feel I should be here to show him about. Barbara appears so listless and disinterested. Tell Sally Maynard I may drop in later. At 7:45, John Quincy took his bathing suit and wandered down Kalia Road. It was another of those nights. A bright moon was riding high. From a bungalow buried under purple alamander came the soft croon of Hawaiian youth. Through the hedges of flaming hibiscus, he caught again the exquisite odors of this exotic island. Mrs. Maynard's big house was a particularly unlovely type of New England architecture, but 100 flowering vines did much to conceal that fact. John Quincy found his hostess enthroned in her great airy drawing room, surrounded by a handsome laughing group of the best people. Pleasant people, too. As she introduced him, he began to wonder if he hadn't been missing a great deal of congenial companionship. I dragged him here against his will, the old lady explained. I felt I owed it to Hawaii, who's been associating with the riffraff long enough. They insisted that he take an enormous chair, pressed cigarettes upon him, showered him with hospitable attention. As he sat down and the chatter was resumed, he reflected that here was as civilized a company as Boston itself could offer. And why not? Most of these families came originally from New England and had kept in their exile the old ideals of culture and caste. It might interest Beacon Street to know, Mrs. Maynard said, that long before the days of '49, the people of California were sending their children over here to be educated in the schools, and importing their wheat from here, too. Go on, tell him the other one, Aunt Sally laughed a pretty girl in blue. That about the first printing press in San Francisco being brought over from Honolulu. Madame Maynard shrugged her shoulders. Oh, what's the use? We're so far away. New England will never get us straight. John Quincy looked up to see Carlotta Egan in the doorway. A moment later, Lieutenant Booth of Richmond appeared at her side. It occurred to the young man from Boston that the fleet was rather overdoing its stop at Honolulu. Mrs. Maynard rose to greet the girl. "Come in, my dear. You know most of these people." She turned to the others. "This is Miss Eden, a neighbor of mine on the beach." It was amusing to note that most of these people knew Carlotta, too. John Quincy smiled. The British Admiralty and the soap business. It must have been rather an ordeal for the girl, but she saw it through with a sweet graciousness that led John Quincy to reflect that she would be at home in England if she went there. Carlotta sat down on a sofa, and while Lieutenant Booth was busily arranging a cushion at her back, John Quincy dropped down beside her. The sofa was, fortunately, too small for three. "I rather expected to see you," he said in a low voice. "I was brought here to meet the best people of Honolulu. I see you're the best of all." She smiled at him, and again the chatter of small talk filled the room. Presently, the voice of a tall young man with glasses rose above the general hubbub. "They got a cable from Joe Clark out of the country club this afternoon." The din ceased, and everyone was in interest. "Clark's our professional," explained the to John. "He went over a month ago to play in the British Open." "Did he win?" asked the girl in blue. "It was put out by Hagen. In the semifinals," the young man said. "But he had the distinction of driving the longest ball ever seen on the St. Andrews course." "Why shouldn't he?" asked an older man. "He's got the strongest wrists I ever saw." "On anybody?" John Quincy sat up, suddenly interested. "How do you account for that?" he asked. The older man smiled. "We've all got pretty big wrists out here," he answered. "Surfboarding, that's what does it. Joe Clark was a time. Body surfing and board surfing. He used to disappear for hours in the rollers out by the reef. The result was a marvelous wrist development. I've seen him drive a golf ball 380 yards. Yes, sir. I'll bet he made those Englishmen sit up and take notice." While John Quincy was thinking this over, someone suggested that it was time for the swim, and confusion reigned. A Chinese servant led the way to the dressing room, which opened off the lanai, and the young people trooped joyously after him. "I'll be waiting for you on the beach," John Quincy said to Carlotta Egan. "I came with Johnny, you know," she reminded him. "I know all about it," he answered. "But it was the weekend you promised. People who try to stretch their weekend through the following Wednesday night deserve all they get." She laughed. "I'll look for you," he agreed. He donned his bathing suit hastily in a room filled with flying clothes and great waving brown arms. Oh. Lieutenant Booth, he noted with satisfaction, was proceeding at a leisurely pace. Hurrying through a door that opened directly on the beach, he waited under a nearby hall tree. Presently, Carlotta came, slender and fragile, looking in the moon. "Ah, here you are," John Quincy cried. The furthest float it is," he answered. They dashed into the warm, silvery water and swam gaily off. 5 minutes later, they sat on the float together. The light on Diamond Head was winking. The lanterns of sampans twinkled out beyond the reef. The shoreline of Honolulu was outlined by a procession of blinking stars controlled by dynamos. In the right heavens hung a lunar rainbow, one colorful end in the Pacific, and the other tumbling into the foliage shore. A gorgeous setting in which to be young and in love, and free to speak at last. John Quincy moved closer to the girl's side. "Great night, isn't it?" he said. "Wonderful," she answered softly. "Carrie, I want to tell you something, and that's why I brought you out here away from the others." Somehow she interrupted. "It doesn't seem quite fair to Johnny." "Never mind him." "Has it ever occurred to you that my name's Johnny too?" She laughed. "Oh, but it couldn't be." "What do you mean?" I simply couldn't call you that. You're too dignified and remote." "John Quincy." "I could call you John Quincy. We'll make up your mind." "You'll have to call me something, because I'm going to be hanging around pretty constantly in the..." "Yes, my dear, I'll probably turn out to be about the least remote person in the world. That is, if I can make you see the future the way I see it." Carrie dearest. A gurgle sounded behind them, and they turned around. Lieutenant Booth was climbing onto the raft. Swam the last 50 yards underwater to surprise you, he sputtered. Well, you succeeded, said John Quincy without enthusiasm. The lieutenant sat down with the manner of one to remain indefinitely. I'll tell the world it's some night, he offered. Speaking of the world, when do you fellows leave Honolulu? Asked John Quincy. I don't know. Tomorrow, I guess. Me. I don't care if I'm never going. Hawaii's not so easy to leave. Is it, Carrie? She shook her head. Hardest place I know of, Johnny. I shall have to be sailing presently, and I know what a wrench it will be. Perhaps I'll follow the example of Violi the swimmer and leave the boat when it passes Waikiki. They wallowed for a moment in silence. Suddenly, John Quincy sat up. What was that you said? He asked. About Violi? Didn't I ever tell you? He was one of our best swimmers, and for years they tried to get him to go to take part in athletic meets like Duke Kahanamoku. But he was sentimentalist, couldn't bring himself to leave Hawaii. Finally, they persuaded him, and one sunny morning he sailed on the Matsonia with a very sad face. When the ship was opposite Waikiki, he slipped overboard and swam ashore. And that was that. He never got on a ship again. You see, John Quincy was on his feet. What time was it when we left the beach? He asked in a low, tense voice. About 8:30, said Booth. John Quincy talked very fast. That means I've got just 30 minutes to get ashore, dress, and reach the dock before the President Tyler sails. I'm sorry to go, but it's vital. Harriet started to tell you something. I don't know when I'll get back, but I must see you when I do, either at Mrs. Maynard's or the hotel. Will you wait up for me? She was startled by the seriousness of his tone. Yes, I'll be waiting, she told him. That's great. He hesitated a moment. It is a risky business to leave the girl you love on a float in moonlight, but it had to be done. I'm off, he said, and Dove, when he came up, he heard the lieutenant's voice. Say, old man, that dive was all wrong. You let me show you. Go to the devil, muttered John Quincy wetly, and swam with long, powerful strokes toward the shore. Now with haste, he plunged into the dressing room, donned his clothes, then dashed out again. No time for apologies, hostess. He ran along the beach to the winter slip house. Haku was dozing in the hall. Wiki wiki, shouted John Quincy. Tell the chauffeur to get the roadster into the drive and start the engine. Travel. Where's Miss Barbara? Last seen on beach, began the startled Haku. On the bench under the haw tree, he found Barbara sitting alone. He stood panting before her. My dear, he said, I know at last who killed your father. She was on her feet. You do? Yes. Shall I tell you? No, she said. No, I can't bear to hear. It's too horrible. Then you've suspected? Yes, just suspicion. A feeling. Intuition. I couldn't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. I went away to get it out of my mind. It's all too terrible. He put his hand on her shoulder. Poor Barbara. Don't you worry. You won't appear in this in any way. I'll keep you out of it. What has happened? Can't stop now. Tell you later. He ran toward the drive. Miss Minerva appeared from the house. Haven't time to talk, he cried, leaping into the roadster. But John Quincy, a curious thing has happened. That lawyer who was here to look at the house, he said that Dan, just a week before he died, spoke to him about a new will. That's good. That's evidence, John Quincy cried. But why a new will? Surely Barbara was all he had. Listen to me. Cut in John Quincy. You delayed me already. Get the big car and go to the station. Tell that to Howard. Tell him, too, that I'm on the President Tyler and to send Chan there at once. He stepped on the gas. By the clock in the automobile, he had just 17 minutes to reach the dock before the President Tyler would sail. He shot like a madman through the brilliant Hawaiian night. Kalakaua Avenue, smooth and deserted, proved a glory. It took him just 8 minutes to travel the 3 miles to the dock. A bit of traffic and an angry policeman in the center of the city caused the delay. A scattering of people and the din pier shed waited for the imminent sailing of the liner. John Quincy dashed through them and up the gangplank. The second officer, Hepworth, stood at the top. "Hello, Mr. Winterslip," he said. "You sailing?" "No, but let me aboard." "I'm sorry. We're about to draw in the plane." "No, you mustn't. This is life and death. Hold off just a few minutes. There's a steward named Bowker. I must find him at once. Life and death, I tell you." Hepworth stood aside. "Oh, well, in that case, but please hurry, sir." "I will." John Quincy passed him on the run. He was on his way to the cabins, presided over by Bowker, when a tall figure caught his eye. A man in a long green ulster and a battered green hat, a hat John Quincy had last seen on the links of the Oahu Country Club. The tall figure moved on up a stairway to the topmost deck. John Quincy followed. He saw the ulster disappear into one of the deluxe cabins. Still, he followed and pushed open the cabin door. The man in the ulster was back too, but he swung round suddenly. "Ah, Mr. Jennison," John Quincy cried. "Were you thinking of sailing on this boat?" For an instant, Jennison stared at him. "I was," he said quietly. "Forget it," John Quincy answered. "You're going ashore with me." "Really? What is your authority?" "No authority whatever," said the boy grimly. "I'm taking you, that's all." Jennison smiled, but there was a gleam of hate behind it. And in John Quincy's heart, usually so gentle and civilized, there was hate too, as he faced this man. He thought of Dan Winterslip, dead on his cot. He thought of Jennison walking down the gangplank with them that morning they landed. Jennison putting his arm about poor Barbara when she faltered under the blow. He thought of the shots fired at him from the bush, of the red-haired man battery in that red room. Well, he must fight again. No way out of it. The siren of the President Tyler sounded a sharp warning. "You get out of here," said Jennison through his teeth. "I'll go with you to the gangplank." He stopped as the disadvantages of that plan came home to him. His right hand went swiftly to his pocket. Inspired, John Quincy seized the filled water bottle and hurled it at the man's head. Jennison dodged. The bottle crashed through one of the windows. The clatter of glass rang through the night, but no one appeared. John Quincy saw Jennison leap toward him, something gleaming in his hand. Stepping aside, he threw himself on the man's back and forced him to his knees. He seized the wrist of Jennison's right hand, which held the automatic, in a firm grip. They kept that posture for a moment, and then Jennison began slowly to rise to his feet. The hand that held the pistol began to tear away. John Quincy shut his teeth and sought to maintain his grip. But he was up against a more powerful antagonist than the red-haired sailor. He was outclassed, and the realization of it crept over him with a sickening force. Jennison was on his feet now, the right hand, though free. Another moment. What then? John Quincy wondered. This man had no intention of letting him go ashore. He had changed that plan the moment he put it into words. A muffled shot, and later in the night, where the ship was well out on the Pacific, John Quincy thought of Boston, his mother. He thought of Carlotta waiting. He summoned his strength for one last desperate effort to renew his grip. A serene, ivory-colored face appeared suddenly at the broken window. An arm with a weapon was extended through the jagged opening. "Relinquish the firearms, Mr. Jennison," commanded Charlie Chan, "or I am forced to make fatal insertion in vital organ belonging to you." Jennison's pistol dropped to the floor, and John Quincy staggered back against the berth. At that instant, the door opened, and Howlett, followed by the detective Spencer, came in. "Hello, Winterslip. What are you doing here?" The captain said. He thrust a paper into one of the pockets of the green ulster. "Come along, Jennison," he said. "We want you." Limply, John Quincy followed them from the stateroom. Outside, they were joined by Chan. At the top of the gangplank, Howlett paused. "We'll wait a minute for Hepworth," he said. John Quincy put his hand on Chan's shoulder. Charlie, how can I ever? You saved my life. Chan bowed. My own pleasure is not to be worded. I have saved a life here and there, but never before one that had beginning in cultured city of Boston. Always a happy item on the golden scroll of memory. Hepworth came up. It's all right, he said. The captain has agreed to delay our sailing 1 hour. I'll go to the station with you. On the way down the gangplank, Chan turned to John Quincy. Speaking heartily for myself, I congratulate your bravery. It is clear you leaped upon Miss Jennison with vigorous and triumphant mood of heart. But he would have pushed you down, and he would have conquered. And why? The answer is, such powerful wrists. A great surfboarder. John Quincy said. Chan looked at him keenly. You are no person's fool. 10 years ago, this Harry Jennison, our champion swimmer in all Hawaii. I extract that news from ancient sporting pages of Honolulu Journal. But he had not been in the water much here lately. Pursuing the truth further, not since the night he killed Dan Winterslip. Chapter 22. The light streams through. They moved on through the pier shed to the street where Hepworth, Jennison, and the 3 policemen got into Howlett's car. The captain turned to John Quincy. You coming, Mr. Winterslip? He inquired. I got my own car, the boy explained. I'll follow you in that. The roadster was not performing at its best, and he reached the station house a good 5 minutes after the policeman. He noted Dan Winterslip's big limousine parked in the street outside. In Howlett's room, he found the captain closeted with a 3rd man. It took a second glance at the latter to identify him as Mr. Saladin, for the little man of the lost teeth now appeared a great deal younger than John Quincy had thought him. Mr. Winterslip, remarked Howlett. He turned to Saladin. Say, Larry, you've got me into a heap of trouble with this boy. He accused me of trying to shield you. I wish you'd loosen up for him. Saladin smiled. Why, I don't mind. My job out here is about finished. Of course Mr. Winterslip will keep what I tell him under his hat. Naturally, replied John Quincy. He noticed that the man spoke with no traceable lisp. I perceive you found your teeth, he added.
Oh, yes, I found them in my trunk, where I put them the day I arrived at Waikiki, answered Saladin.
When my teeth were knocked out 20 years ago in a football game, I was broken-hearted, but the loss has been a great help to me in my work. A man hunting his birch work in the water is a figure of ridicule and mirth. No one ever thinks of connecting him with serious affairs. He can prowl about a beach to his heart's content. Mr. Winterslip, I am a special agent of the Treasury Department, sent out here to break up the opium ring. My name, of course, is not Saladin. Oh, said John Quincy. I understand at last. I'm glad you do, remarked Howlett. I don't know whether you're familiar with the way our opium smugglers work. The dope is brought in from the Orient on tramp steamers. The _ Mary S. Allison _ for example. Then they arrive off Waikiki. They knock together a few small rafts and load them with tins of the stuff. A fleet of little boats, supposedly out there for the fishing, pick up these rafts and bring the dope ashore. It's taken downtown and hidden on ships bound for Frisco, usually those that ply only between here and the mainland because they're not so closely watched at the other end. But it just happened that the quartermaster of the President Tyler is one of their go-betweens. We searched his cabin this evening and found it packed with this stuff. The quartermaster of the President Tyler, repeated John Quincy. That's Dick Koala's friend. Yeah, I'm coming to Dick. He's been in charge of the pickup Frink here. He was out on that business the night of the murder. Saladin saw him and told me all about it in that note, which was my reason for letting the boy go. I owe you an apology, John Quincy said. Oh, that's all right. Howlett was in great good humor. Larry here has got some of the higher-ups too. For instance, he's discovered that Jennison is the lawyer for the ring, defending any of them who are caught and brought before the commissioner. The fact has no bearing on Dan Wood's murder unless we knew about it. And that was one of the reasons he didn't want Jennison to marry his girl. Saladin stood up. I'll turn the quartermaster over to you, he said. In view of this other charge, you can, of course, have Jennison too. That's all for me? I'll go along. See you tomorrow, Larry, Helen answered. Saladin went out, and the captain turned to John Quincy. Well, my boy, this is our big night. I don't know what you were doing in Jennison's cabin, but if you'd picked him for the murderer, I'll say you're good. That's just what I done, John Quincy told him. By the way, have you seen my aunt? She's got a hold of a rather interesting bit of information. I've seen her, Hallett said. Now, like he is coming to his friend. She stopped this book, doesn't coming to his book. She says that is something that was not tremendously. By the way, Green's waiting for us. Come along. They went into the prosecutor's office. Green was alert and eager. A stenographer was at his elbow, and Miss Minerva sat near his desk. Hello, Mr. Winterslope, he said. What do you think of our police force now? Pretty good. Well, pretty good. Sit down, won't you? He glanced through some papers on his desk, while John Quincy, Hallett, and Chan found chairs. I don't mind telling you, this thing has knocked me all in the... Harry Jennison and I are old friends. I had lunch with him at the club only yesterday. I'm going to proceed a little differently than I would with an ordinary criminal. John Quincy half rose from his chair. Don't get excited, Green smiled. Jennison will get all that's coming to him, friendship or no friendship. What I mean is that if I can save the territory, the expense of a long trial, by driving the confession out of him at once, I intend to do it. He's coming in here in a moment, and I propose to reveal my whole hand to him from start to finish. That may seem foolish, but it isn't. For I hold aces, all aces, and he'll know it as quickly as anyone. The door opened. Spencer ushered Jennison into the room, and then withdrew. The accused man stood there, proud, haughty, defiant, a Viking of the tropics, a blonde giant at bay, but unafraid. Hello, Jennison, Green said. I'm mighty sorry about this. You ought to be, Jennison replied. You're making an awful fool of yourself. What is this damned nonsense, anyhow? Sit down, said the prosecutor sharply. He indicated a chair on the opposite side of the desk. He had already turned the shade on his desk lamp, so the light would shine full in the face of anyone sitting there. Lamp bother you, Harry? He asked. Why should it? Jennison demanded. Good, smiled Green. I believe Captain Howett served you with a warrant on the boat. Have you looked at it by any chance? I have. The prosecutor leaned across the desk. Murder Jennison. Jennison's expression did not change. Damned nonsense, as I told you. Why should I murder anyone? The motive, Green replied. You're quite right. We should begin with that. Do you wish to be represented here by counsel? Jennison shook his head. I guess I'm lawyer enough to puncture this silly business, he replied. Very well. Green turned to his stenographer. Get this. The man nodded, and the prosecutor addressed Miss Minerva. Miss Winterslip, we'll start with you. Miss Minerva leaned forward. Mr. Dan Winterslip's house on the beach has, as I told you, been offered for sale by his daughter. After dinner this evening, a gentleman came to look at it, a prominent lawyer named Haley. As we went over the house, Mr. Haley mentioned that he had met Dan Winterslip on the street a week before his death, and that my cousin had spoken to him about coming in shortly to draw up a new will. He did not say what the provisions of the will were to be, nor did he ever carry out his intention. Ah, yes, said Green, but Mr. Jennison here was your cousin's lawyer. He was. If he wanted to draw a new will, he wouldn't ordinarily have gone to a stranger for that purpose. Not ordinarily. Unless he had some good reason. Precisely. Unless, for instance, the will had some connection with Harry Jennison. I object, Jennison cried. This is mere conjecture. So it is, Green answered. But we're not in court. We can conjecture if we like. Suppose Miss Winterslip, the will was concerned with Jennison in some way. What do you imagine the connection to have been? I don't have to imagine, replied Miss Minerva. I know And that's good. Go on. Before I came down here tonight, I had a talk with my niece. She admitted that her father knew she and Jennison were in love, and that he had bitterly opposed the match. He had even gone so far as to say he would disinherit her if she went through with it. Then, the new will Dan Winterslip intended to make would probably have been to the effect that in the event his daughter married Jennison, she was not to inherit a penny of his money. There isn't any doubt of it, said Miss Minerva firmly. You asked for a motive, Jennison, Green said. That's motive enough for me. Everybody knows you're money mad. You wanted to marry Winterslip's daughter, the richest girl in the islands. He said you couldn't have her. Not with the money, too. But you're not the sort to make a penniless marriage. You were determined to get both Barbara Winterslip and her father's property. Only one person stood in your way, Dan Winterslip. And that's how you happened to be on his lanai that Monday night. I wasn't on his lanai. I was on board the President Tyler, and everybody knows that the ship didn't land its passengers until 9 the following morning. I'm coming to that, being told just now. By the way, what time is it? Jennison took from his pocket a watch on the end of a slender chain. It's 9:15. Ah, yes. Is that the watch you usually carry? It is. Ever wear a wristwatch? Jennison hesitated. Occasionally? Only occasionally. The prosecutor rose and came round his desk. Let me see your left wrist, please. Jennison held out his arm. It was tanned a deep brown, but on the wrist was etched in white the outline of a watch and its encircling strap. Green smiled. Yes, you have worn a wristwatch, and you've worn it pretty constantly, from the look of things. He took a small object from his pocket and held it in front of Jennison. This watch? Perhaps. Jennison regarded it stonily. Ever see it before? Green asked. No? Well, suppose we try it on anyhow. He put the watch in position and fastened it. I can't help noting, Harry, he continued, that it fits rather neatly over that white outline in your wrist. And the prong of the buckle falls naturally into the most worn of the holes on the strap. What of that? Asked Jennison. Oh, coincidence probably. You have abnormally large wrists, however. Surfboarding, swimming, yeah? But that's something else I'll speak of later. He turned to Miss Minerva. Will you please come over here, Miss Winterslip? She came, and as she reached his side, the prosecutor suddenly bent over and switched off the light on his desk. Save for a faint glimmer through a transom, the room was in darkness. Miss Minerva was conscious of dim, huddled figures, a circle of white faces, a tense silence. The prosecutor was lifting something slowly toward her startled eyes. Ultimately, a watch worn on a human wrist, a watch with an illuminated dial on which the figure, too, was almost obliterated. Look at that, and tell me, came the prosecutor's voice. You have seen it before. I have, she answered firmly. Where? In the dark, in Dan Winterslip's living room, just after midnight, the 30th of June. Green flashed on the light. Thank you, Miss Winterslip. He retired behind his desk and pressed a button. You identify it by some distinguishing mark, I presume? I do. The numeral 2, which is pretty well obscured. Spencer appeared at the door. Send the Spaniard in, Green ordered. That is all for the present, Miss Winterslip. Cabrera entered, and his eyes were frightened as they looked at Jennison. At a nod from the prosecutor, Chan removed the wristwatch and handed it to the Spaniard. You know that watch, Jose? Green asked. Yes, answered the boy. Don't be afraid, Green urged. Nobody's going to hurt you. I want you to repeat the story you told me this afternoon. You have no regular job? You're a sort of confidential errand boy for Mr. Jennison here. I was. Yes, that's all over now. You can speak out. On the morning of Wednesday, July 2nd, you were in Mr. Jennison's office. He gave you this wristwatch and told you to take it out and get it repaired. Something was the matter with it. It wasn't running. You took it to a big jewelry store. What happened? The man said it is very badly hurt. To fix it would cost more than a new watch. I go back and tell Mr. Jennison. He laughs and say that it is mine as a gift. Precisely. Green referred to a paper on his desk. Late in the afternoon of Thursday, July 3rd, he sold the watch. To whom? To Lavaho, Chinese jeweler in Mauna Kea Street. On Saturday evening, maybe 6 o'clock, Mr. Jennison. Telephone my home. Much excited. Must have watch again, and will pay any price. I speed to Lavaho's store. Watch is sold once more, now to unknown Japanese. Late at night, I see Mr. Jennison, and he cursed me with anger. Get the watch, he says. I have been hunting, but I could not find it. Green turned to Jennison. You are a little careless with that watch, Harry, but no doubt you figured you were pretty safe. You had your alibi. Then, too, when Holland detailed the clues to you on Winter Slips Lanai, the morning after the crime, he forgot to mention that someone had seen the watch. It was one of those happy accidents that are all we have to count on. But Saturday night, you realized your danger. Just how you discovered it, I don't know. I do, John Quincy interrupted. What? What's that? Said Green. On Saturday afternoon, John Quincy told him, I played golf with Mr. Jennison. On our way back to town, we talked over the clues in this case, and I happened to mention the wristwatch. I can see now it was the first he had heard of it. He was to dine with us at the beach, but he asked to be put down at his office to sign a few. I waited below. It must have been then that he called up this young man in an effort to locate the watch. Great stuff, said Green, enthusiast. That finishes the watch, Jennison. I'm surprised you wore it, but you probably knew that it would be vital to you to keep track of the time, and you figured, rightly, that it would not be immediately affected by the salt wall. What the devil are you talking about? Amanda Jennison. Again, Green pressed a button on his desk. Spencer appeared at once. Take this Spaniard, the prosecutor directed, and bring in Hepworth and the quartermaster. He turned again to Jennison. I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a minute. On the night of June 30th, you were a passenger on the Dash President Tyler, which was lying by until dawn out near the channel entrance. I was. No passengers were landed from that ship until the following morning. That's a matter of record. Very well. The second officer of the President Tyler came in, followed by a big hulking sailorman, John Quincy, recognized as the quartermaster of that vessel. He was interested to note a ring on the man's right hand. His mind went back to that encounter in the San Francisco attic. Mr. Hepworth, the prosecutor, began. On the night of June 30th, your ship reached this port too late to dock. You anchored off Waikiki. On such an occasion, who is on deck? Say, from midnight on. The second officer, Hepworth told him. In this case, myself. Also, the quartermaster. The accommodation ladder is let down the night before. Usually, yes, it was let down. Who is stationed near it? The quartermaster. Ah, yes. You were in charge then on the night of June 30th. Did you notice anything unusual on that occasion? Hepworth nodded. I did. The quartermaster appeared to be under the influence of liquor. At 3 o'clock, I found him dozing near the accommodation ladder. I roused him. When I came back from checking up the anchor bearings before turning in at dawn, about 4:30, he was dead to the world. I put him in his cabin, and the following morning, I of course reported him. You noticed nothing else out of the ordinary? Nothing, sir, Hepworth replied. Thank you very much. Now, you Green, you turned to the quartermaster. You were drunk on duty the night of June 30th. Where did you get the booze? The man hesitated. Before you say anything, let me give you a bit of advice. The truth, my man. You're in pretty bad already. I'm not making any promises, but if you talk straight here, it may help you in that other matter. If you lie, it will go that much harder with you. I ain't going to lie, promised the quartermaster. All right, where did you get your liquor? The man nodded toward Jennison. He gave it to me. He did, eh? Tell me all about it. I met him on deck just after midnight. We were still moving. I knew him before, him and me. Amy Opium being both of you. I understand that. You met him on deck. I did. And he says, "You're on watch tonight." And I says, "I am." So he slips me a little bottle and says, "This will help you pass the time. I ain't a drinking man, so help me, I ain't." And I took just a nip with something that was else. My head was all funny, like, unquote, the next I knew, I was waked up in my cabin with the bad news I was wanted above. What became of that bottle? Dropped it overboard on my way to Cactus. I didn't want nobody to find it. Did you see anything the night of June 30th? Anything peculiar? I seen plenty, sir, but it was that drink. Nothing you would want to hear about. All right. Prosecutor turned to Jennison. Well, Harry, you drugged him, didn't you? Why? Because you were going ashore, eh? Because you knew he'd be on duty at that ladder when you returned, and you didn't want him to see you. So you dropped something into that whiskey. Guess work, cut in Jennison, still unruffled. I used to have some respect for you as a lawyer, but it's all gone now. If this is the best you can offer. But it isn't, said Green pleasantly. Again, he pushed the button. I've something much better, Harry, if you'll only wait. He turned to Hepworth. There's a steward on your ship named Bowker, he began. And John Quincy thought that Jennison stiffened. How has he been behaving lately? Well, he got pretty drunk in Hong Kong, Hepworth answered. But that, of course, was the money. What money? It's this way. The last time we sailed out of Honolulu Harbor for the Orient, over 2 weeks ago, I was in the purser's office. It was just as we were passing Diamond Head. Bowker came in, and he had a big fat envelope that he wanted to deposit in a purser's safe. He said it contained a lot of money. The purser wouldn't be responsible without seeing. So, Bowker slid the envelope, and there were 10 $100 bills. The purser made another package of it and put it in the safe. He told me Bowker took out a couple of the bills when he reached Hong Kong. Where would a man like Bowker get all that money? I can't imagine. He said he'd put over a business deal in Honolulu, but we knew Bowker. The door opened. Evidently Spencer guessed who was wanted this time, for he pushed Bowker into the room. The steward of the President, Tyler, was bedraggled and bleary. Hello, Bowker, said the prosecutor. Sober now, aren't you? I'll tell the world I am, replied Bowker. They've walked me to San Francisco and back. Can I sit down? Of course, Green smiled. This afternoon, where you were still drunk, you told a story to Willie Chan out at Okamoto's auto stand on Kalakaua Avenue. Later on, early this evening, you repeated it to Captain Howard and me. I'll have to ask you to go over it again. Bowker glanced toward Jennison, then quickly looked away. Always ready to oblige, he answered. You're a steward on the President, Tyler. Green. On your last trip over here from the mainland, Mr. Jennison occupied one number 97. He was alone in it, I believe. All alone. He paid extra for the privilege, I hear. Always traveled that way. Room 97 was on the main deck, not far from the accommodation ladder. Yes, that's right. Tell us what happened after you anchored off Waikiki the night of June 30th. Bowker adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses to the gesture of a man about to an afternoon speech. Well, I was up pretty late that night. Mr. Winterslip here had loaned me some books. There was one I was particularly interested in. I wanted to finish it so I could give it to him to take ashore in the morning. It was nearly 2 o'clock when I finally got through it, and I was feeling stuffy, so I went on deck for a breath of air. You stopped not far from the accommodation ladder. Yes, sir. I did. Did you notice the quartermaster? Yes. He was sound asleep in a deck chair. I went over and leaned on the rail. The ladder was just beneath me. I'd been standing there a few minutes when suddenly somebody came up out of the and put his hands on the lowest rung. I drew back quickly and stood in a shadow. Well, pretty soon this man comes creeping up the ladder to the deck. He was barefooted and all in black pants and shirt. I watched him. He went over and bent above the quartermaster, then started towards me down the deck. He was walking on tiptoe, but even then, I didn't get wise to the fact anything was wrong. I stepped out of the shadow. Fine night for a swim, Mr. Jennison, I said, and I saw at once that I'd made a social error. He gave one jump in my direction, and his hands closed on my throat. I thought my time had come. He was wet, wasn't he? Green asked, dripping. He left a trail of water on the deck. Did you notice a watch on his wrist? Yes, but you can bet I didn't make any study of it. I had other things to think about just then. I managed to sort of ooze out of his grip, and I told him to cut it out or I'd yell. Look here, he says, you and I can talk business, I guess. Come into my cabin. But I wasn't wanting any tete-a-tete with him in any cabin. I said I'd see him in the morning, and after I'd promised to say nothing to anybody, he let me go. I went to bed pretty much puzzled. The next morning, when I went into his cabin, there he was, all fresh and rosy and smiling. If I'd had so much as a whiff of booze the night before, I'd have thought I never saw what I did. I went in there thinking I might get $100 out of the affair, but the minute he spoke, I began to smell important. He said no one must know about his swim the night before. How much did I want? Well, I held my breath and said $10,000. And I nearly dropped dead when he answered I could have it. Bowker turned to John Quincy. I don't know what you'll think of me. I don't know what Ting would think. I'm not a crook by nature, but I was fed up and choking over that steward job. I wanted a little newspaper of my own. And up to that minute, I couldn't see myself getting it. And you must remember that I didn't know then what was in murder. Later, when I did find out, I was scared to breathe. I didn't know what they could do to me. He turned to Green. That's all fixed, he said. I've promised you immunity. The prosecutor answered. I'll keep my word. Go on. You agreed to accept the $10,000? I did. I went to his office at 12. One of the conditions was that I could stay on the President Tyler until she got back to San Francisco. And after that, I was never to show my face out this. It suited me. Mr. Jennison introduced me to this Cabrera, who was to chaperone me the rest of that day. I'll say he did. When I went aboard the ship, he handed me $1,000 in an envelope. When I came back this time, I was to spend the day with Cabrera and get the other $9,000 when I sailed. This morning when we tied up, I saw the Spaniard on the dock, but by the time I landed, he had disappeared. I met this Relly Chan, and we had a large day. This fusel oil they sell out here, loosened by Tom, but I'm not sorry. Of course, the rosy dream is faded, and it's my flat feet on the deck from now to the end of time. But the shore isn't so much anymore, with all the bar rooms under cover. And this sea life keeps a man out on the open air. As I say, I'm not sorry I talked. I can look any man in the eye again and tell him to go to... He glanced at Miss Minerva. Madam, I will not name the precise locality. Green stood. Well, Jennison, there's my case. I've ticked it all off to you, but I wanted you to see for yourself how airtight it is. There are two courses open to you. You can let this go to trial with a plea of not guilty. A long, humiliating ordeal for you. Or you can confess here and now and throw yourself on the mercy of the court. If you're the sensible man I think you are, that's what you'll do. Jennison did not answer, did not even look at the prosecutor. It was a very neat idea, Green went on. I'll grant you that. Only one thing puzzles me. Did it come as the inspiration of the moment, or did you plan it all out in advance? You've been over to the mainland rather often. Of late, were you waiting your chance? Anyhow, came, didn't it? It came at last. And for a swimmer, like you, child's play. You didn't need that ladder when you left the vessel. Perhaps you went overboard while the underscore President Tyler was still moving. A quick silent dive, a little way underwater in case anyone was watching from the deck, and then a long but easy swim ashore. And there you were, on the beach at Waikiki. Not far away, Dan Winterslip was asleep on his lanai, if not so much as a locked door between you. Dan Winterslip, who stood between you and what you wanted. The little struggle, a quick thrust of your knife. Come on, Jennison, don't be a fool. It's the best way out for you now. A full confession. Jennison leaped to his feet, his eyes flashing. And I'll see you in hell first, he cried. Very well, you feel that way about it. Green turned his back upon him and began a low-toned conversation with Howard. Jennison and Charlie Chan were together on one side of the desk. Chan took out a pencil and accidentally dropped it on the floor. He stooped to pick it up. John Quincy saw that the butt of a pistol carried in Chan's hip pocket protruded from under his coat. He saw Jennison spring forward and snatched the gun. With a cry, John Quincy moved nearer, but Green seized his arm and held him. Charlie Chan seemed unaccountably oblivious to what was going on. Jennison put the muzzle of the pistol to his forehead and pulled the trigger. A sharp click. That was all. The pistol fell from his hand. "That's it!" cried Green triumphantly. That's my confession, and not a word spoken. Of witnesses, Jennison, they all saw you. You couldn't stand the disgrace. A man in your position, you tried to kill yourself with an empty gun. Went over and patted Chan on the shoulder. "A great idea, Charlie," he said. Chan thought of it. He added to Jennison, "The Oriental Nine, Harry. Rather subtle, isn't it?" But Jennison had dropped back into his chair and buried his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," said Green gently, "but we've got you. Maybe you'll talk now." Jennison looked up slowly. The defiance was gone from his face. It was lined and old. "Maybe I will," he said hoarsely. Chapter 23. Without inserted and they filed out, leaving Jennison with Green and the stenographer. In the anteroom, Chan approached John Quincy. "You go home decked in the shining garments of success," he said. "One thought are tantalizing. At simultaneous moment, you arrive at same conclusion. We do. To reach there, you must have left across considerable cavity." John Quincy laughed. "I'll say I did. It came to me tonight. First, someone mentioned a golf professional with big wrists who drove a long ball. I had a quick flash of Jennison on the links here and his terrific drives. Big wrists, they told me, meant that a man was proficient in the water. Then, someone else, a young woman, spoke of a champion swimmer who left a ship off Waikiki. That was the first time the idea of such a thing had occurred to me. I was pretty warm then, and I felt Balker was the man who could verify my suspicions. When I rushed aboard the President Tyler to find him, I saw Jennison about to sail, and that confirmed my theory. I went after him. A brave performance, commented Chan. But as you can see, Charlie, I didn't have an iota of real evidence. Just guesswork. You were the one who furnished the proof. Proof are essential in this business, Chan replied. I'm tantalized too, Charlie. I remember you in the library. You were on the track long before I was. How come? Chan grinned. I wondered if you wanted to do with a lot, which was a big spirit, but what to be your nervous, and if it was a big promise. So a lot of your district. A look, a laugh, a gesture, something go click. Boker enters and hovering above, says with alcoholic accent, I'm my own master, ain't I? In my mind, the click. He is not own master. I follow to dock. Behold when Spaniard present envelope. But for days, I am fogged. I can only learn Cabrera and Genason are very close. Clues continue to burst in our countenance. The occasion remains suspensive. Then at the library, I read of Genason, the fine swimmer. After that, the watch, in triumph. Miss Minerva moved on toward the door. May I have great honor to accompany you to car as Chan. Outside, John Quincy directed the chauffeur to return alone to Waikiki with the limousine. You're riding out with me, he told his aunt. I want to talk with you. She turned to Charlie Chan. I congratulate you. You've got brains, and they count. He bowed low. From you, that compliment glows rosy red. At this moment of parting, my heart droops. My final wish, the snowy chilling days of winter and the scorching windless days of summer, may they all be the springtime. You're very kind, she said softly. John Quincy took its hand. It's been great fun knowing you, Charlie, he remarked. We will go again to the mainland, Chan said. The angry ocean rolling between us. Still, I shall carry the memory of your friendship. like a flower in my heart. John Quincy climbed into the car. And the parting may not be eternal. Chen added cheerfully, the joy of travel may yet be mine. I shall look forward to the day when I may call upon you in your home and shake a healthy. John Quincy started the car slipping away. They left Charlie standing like a grip on. Poor Barbara, said Miss Minerva presently. I dread to face her with this news. But then, it's not altogether news at that. She told me she'd been conscious of something wrong between her and Jennison ever since they landed. She didn't think he killed her father, but she believed she was involved in it somehow. She's planning to settle with Braid tomorrow and leave the next day, probably forever. I've persuaded her to come to Boston for a long visit. You'll see her there. John Quincy shook his head. No, I shan't. But thanks for reminding me. I must go to the cable office at once. When he emerged from the office and again entered the car, he was smiling happily. In San Francisco, he explained, Roger accused me of being a Puritan survival. He ran over a little list of adventures he said had never happened to me. Well, most of them have happened now. I cabled to tell him so. I also said I'd take that job with him. Miss Minerva frowned. Think it over carefully, she warned. San Francisco isn't Boston. The cultural standard is, I fancy, much lower. You'll be lonely there. Oh, no, I shan't. Someone will be there with me. At least, I hope she will. Agatha? No, not Agatha. The cultural standard was too low for her. She's broken our engagement. Barbara, then. Not Barbara either. But I have sometimes thought you thought Barbara sent Jennison packing because of it. Jennison thought so too. It's all clear now. That was why he tried to frighten me into leaving Honolulu and set his opium-running friends on me when I wouldn't go. But Barbara is not in love with me. We understand now why she broke her engagement. Neither Agatha nor Barbara, repeated Miss Minerva. Then who? You haven't met her yet, but that happy privilege of yours before you sleep. The sweetest girl in the islands or in the world. The daughter of Jim Egan, whom you have been heard to refer to as a glorified beachcomber. Again, Miss Minerva frowned. It's a great risk, John Quincy. She hasn't just our background. No, and that's a pleasant change. She's the niece of your old friend. You knew that? I did, answered Miss Minerva softly. Your dear friend of the 80s. What was it you said to me? If your chance ever comes, I hope you will be very happy, his aunt said. When you write it to your mother, be sure and mention Captain Cope of the British Admiralty. Poor Grace, that will be all she'll have to cling to after the wreck. What wreck? The wreck of all her hopes for you. Nonsense. Mother will understand. She knows I'm a roaming winter slip, and when we roam, they found Madame Maynard seated in her living room with a few of her more elderly guests. From the beach came the sound of youthful revelry. Well, my boy, the old woman cried, it appears you couldn't stay away from your policeman friends one single evening after all. I give you up. John Quincy laughed. I'm Pa now. By the way, Carlota Egan, is she? They're all out there somewhere, the hostess said. They came in for a bit of supper. By the way, there are sandwiches in the dining room. And not just now, said John Quincy. Thank you so much. I'll see you again. A group of young people under the haw tree informed him that Carlota Egan was on the farthest float, alone. Well, no, that naval lieutenant, he was. He reflected as he hurried on toward the water, a bit fed up with the Navy. That was hardly the attitude he should have taken, considering all that he had done. But it was human, and John Quincy was human at last. For an instant, he stood at the water's edge. His bathing suit was in the dressing room, but he never gave it a thought. He kicked off his shoes, tossed aside his coat, and plunged into the breakers. The blood of the wandering winter slips was racing through his veins, hot blood that tropical waters had ever been powerless to cool. Sure enough, Carlota Egan and Lieutenant Beath were together on the float. John Quincy climbed up beside them. Well, I'm back, he announced. I'll tell the world you're back, said the lieutenant. And all wet, too. They sat there, across 1,000 miles of warm water. The trade winds came to fan their cheeks. Just above the horizon hung the Southern Cross. The island lights trembled along the yellow eye on Diamond Head. A gorgeous setting. Only one thing was wrong with it. It seemed rather crowded. John Quincy had an inspiration. Just as I hit the water, he remarked, I thought I heard you say something about my dive. Didn't you like it? It was rotten, replied the lieutenant amiably. You offered to show me what was wrong with it, I believe. Sure, if you want me to. By all means, said John Quincy. Learn one thing every day. That's my motto. Lieutenant Booth went to the end of the springboard. In the first place, always keep your ankles close together, like this. I've got you, answered John Quincy, and hold your arms tight against your ear. The tighter the better, as far as I'm concerned. Then double up like a jackknife, instructor. He doubled up like a jackknife and rose into the air. At the same instant, John Quincy seized the girl's hands. Listen to me. I can't wait another second. Not about you. Ever since that day on the ferry. But your people? What about my people? It's just you and I. We'll live in San Francisco. That is, if you love me, well, in heaven's name, be quick. That human submarine is floating around here under us. You love me, don't you? You'll marry me? Yes. He took her in his arms and kissed her. Only the wandering winter slips could kiss like that. The stay-at-homes had always secretly begrudged them the accomplishment. The girl broke away at last, breathless. Johnny, she cried. A sputter beside them, and Lieutenant Booth climbed onto the float, moist and pale. Was that? He gurgled. She was speaking to me, cried John Quincy triumphantly. The end.